turn to Matthew chapter 9, and I want to finish chapter 9 and move into chapter 10. Not quite sure how far we will get, we will see. But you may remember that in this section, we said that to think of Jesus as healing, calling, and responding. Jesus has a very active ministry. And I want to keep hammering on this because when we get later on in the book of Matthew, toward the end, there is going to be a radical, major shift in the ministry of Jesus. And it's subtle, but it's powerful. And if we're not careful, we just go right on by and we don't notice. It wasn't until I read a Christian author named Henry Nouwen that he pointed this out in the Gospels that I was just like, well, yeah, of course that's happened. It just didn't arrest my attention. And he wrote an article that was called, and when I use this phrase, it almost sounds, what's the word? It's a paradoxical statement, but the title of the article was called Active Waiting. Now, how do you put those two together? And he said, well, if you think about the ministry of Jesus, up until his betrayal, and when we get to the betrayal scene in the garden later on, we'll see this. Up until his betrayal, Jesus' ministry was very, very, very active. Now, he did have times where he would go up into the mountain to be alone in prayer. And if I think about it, and we have a whole lesson just on Jesus' prayer life later on in Matthew, we'll see this. There are times when he's able to just get away from the crowd and be alone with God. But most of the time, he's healing, he's calling, he's responding, he's in conflict with the religious leaders, he's performing miracles, just all kinds of stuff that he's doing. And then, at the point of his betrayal, where he is handed over, Nouwen gives the insight that that's the moment at which Jesus' ministry transitions from being very, very active to being completely inactive. That instead of his ministry now doing everything, at the moment of his betrayal to the time of his resurrection, everything is done to him. Oh, what a neat insight. So much so that Nouwen makes this comment. It's really made me scratch my head and wonder how that might look in my life, and I'll certainly throw it out for you to consider it. But he makes the comment sometimes we need to be aware of the fact that God's greatest work through us is when we're most passive. Oh, that sort of changes the model a little bit, doesn't it? Because think of how we typically think. Well, something's not going to get done unless I jump in and do it. And we just tend to think of ourselves doing everything. When in reality, there is the possibility. And remember, when we say we want to be disciples of Jesus, we're following in his steps. Well, this may be part of the whole lifestyle of following Jesus, being aware that during the moments when we're most passive, God can do his greatest work. And I'll give you a little example, and I think it cracks open the doorway for us to understand this. How many times have you gone to visit someone, maybe even at the funeral home? They've lost a family member, and you didn't know what to say, and the reason I can say this is because this happened when my father died. People from the congregation drove from Lansing, Michigan down to Indianapolis, Indiana, and people show up at the funeral home. They're there, but I couldn't tell you anything they said. What I just remember was their being there, okay? And so God working through them just being there was powerful. Or if you've been sick and in the hospital and somebody comes and sits down beside your bed, they don't say much, but they reach out and hold your hand. What a great passive ministry. God's working through that. And we kind of know that, but we don't talk about it enough. That sometimes the moments when we do the least, but make ourselves open for God to work through us, can be some of the most powerful moments of our life. So, and we'll talk more about that when we get later on in Matthew. But that's intriguing to me. Okay, as we noticed that we talked about Jesus forgiving and healing a paralyzed man, where he was taking together this idea, his power to forgive as well as his power to heal. And it's interesting, see, and think about this. The religious leaders could dismiss Jesus' power to forgive because they would say, well, now there's only one that can forgive, and that's God in heaven. What they couldn't dismiss, though they tried, was the actual miracles that he performed. And the only thing they could come up with, oh, okay, we know how he's doing that. It's by the power of the devil himself. Well, it'd be interesting if you could have been in the room where they're sitting down trying to concoct this approach and see how in the world they came up with that, because you know good and well that they knew that all of the good things that were being done by the power of Jesus could not be attributed really to the devil. But that's the only thing they could come up with. Then we saw in chapter 9 the calling of Matthew. And again, this is an amazing calling, and we just need to be aware of several things as Jesus calls Matthew. Matthew is sitting at the collector's booth. He's at his job, and Jesus calls him, and Jesus says, follow me. He gets up and he follows. Their practical details are left out. I mean, did Matthew say, now wait a minute, Jesus, I got to gather up all this change before I go? Yeah, we don't know. If he's sitting at the tax collector's booth, I guarantee you there was some money there. So, but we don't have the details of, did Jesus allow him to gather everything up and put it in his pocket before he went? It just simply says he followed. You see, that's the key point. And we're going to see this in Matthew. And we're going to talk about this morning because we're going to talk about calling. When Jesus calls disciples to follow him, he wants that decision to be clear and simple. Not a whole lot of people saying, well, I'll follow you, but first let me bury my father because he died. Or I bought some oxen. Let me go and try them out before I follow you. You know, and we're going to come to that. Jesus says, no, just come and follow. He followed him. And then we see that Jesus has dinner at Matthew's house. And again, we've got to spend a little time on that, because in the ancient world, open up your home with hospitality was just part of that culture. But there were certain people that you did not eat dinner with. One was a tax collector. But apparently Matthew, in this setting, he's got all of his other friends there. Jesus goes in and participates. Now, that's amazing. Jesus, I'm trying to think how to phrase this. Jesus sees value in persons and opportunities for ministry where a lot of the religious leaders would not dare go. And that's another thing that gets him in trouble. Remember, we've talked about all through Matthew so far, he'll say and do things that just tighten the noose around his neck, so to speak. Here's one of them. He's willing to go and sit down with Matthew, the tax collector, and his friends, and have dinner with them. And the Pharisees, you can see them shaking their heads. What is he up to? And then Jesus issues this challenge, and it's twice in the book of Matthew. There are some individuals, in talking about the book of Matthew, will say, there's not a whole lot of grace in the book of Matthew. Well, Jesus' whole ministry is immersed in grace. This is one of the proofs of it. He tells them, what I want you to do is go and learn what this means, that I desire mercy and not sacrifice. And that sacrifice, I think we've already talked about it twice, is that it can deal with two things. On the one hand, a person thinking they sacrifice so much that God, they deserve so much from God. Look at what I've given up, so God, this is what I deserve. Then the other is, and I think this is where a lot of the emphasis Jesus has on this term is the rituals and the expectations and requirements of the sacrificial system. And the Pharisees were very good at that. They knew how to dot the I's and cross the T's. And Jesus says, no, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. And he's going to develop that a little bit later. And we're going to see a little bit more detail that's added to that. But it's interesting, and I don't know what you would come up with, if you could think about reading the Gospel of Matthew, then pushing it back and saying, okay, what are the 2 or 3 things that were basic bottom line principles that really upheld the whole ministry of Jesus? What would be some of those foundational pillars? This is one of them. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. I had someone recently, because they were aware of this very verse, said, because you said that, and I think I mentioned in a sermon, because you said that, it's made me reevaluate my relationship with another person, and I've got to totally change my response. I was like, good, because that means you're thinking of your relationship with that person in terms of what Jesus would do. That's fantastic. But think about it. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. And we looked last week, we took a little bit of time to look through the Gospel of Matthew, several places where mercy specifically comes up, and twice where Jesus will quote from Hosea chapter 6 and verse 6. And then where he says very clearly, I have come to call sinners. And since all of us are sinners, he's come to call us. And we respond to that call and his ministry. If you look, I think we touched on this toward the end. In chapter 9, 14 through 17, Jesus' question about fasting. And again, this goes with the sacrificial part, or kind of the set in stone religious practices, and part of that was fasting. And the Pharisees were sort of mystified. How is it that we and the Pharisees fast often, and it's John's disciples asking him, but your disciples don't fast? This goes to the core of do's and don'ts in religion. Okay? And I'm always amazed how that everybody's list of do's and don'ts don't always match. Have you ever noticed that? That sometimes something that you take is so crucial, somebody else just passes away with a wave of the hand. You're like, how can you do that? Why isn't that important to you? Because there's a part of us that really struggles with this whole dynamic, that what's important for me, it should be important to you too. So, and we struggle with that. And I think what you're going to find with Jesus is, first of all, your convictions need to be yours. And then the second step is, if you're going to be my disciples, you have to learn how to practice mercy. I desire mercy instead of sacrifice. And I'm really convinced about this. A measure of our spiritual maturity is how we interact and handle other people who don't believe what we believe. I am really convinced of that. How do you treat people who don't believe what you believe? How do you interact with them when they have a whole different set of do's that are kind of your list of don'ts? How do you interact with that? How do you handle that? And if we have in our mind this whole rubric of having the mind of Jesus, that'll help us. Jesus desires mercy and not sacrifice. So John's disciples are mystified. And here's Jesus' answer. How can the guests of the bridegroom mourn while he's with them? The time will come when the bridegroom will be taken away from them, and they will fast. And then no one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, for the patch will pull away from the garment, making the tear worse. And neither do people put new wine in old wineskins. If they do, the skins will burst, and the wine will run out, and the wineskins will be ruined. No, they pour new wine into new wineskins, and both are preserved. This is another foundational concept of Jesus' ministry. He's not coming to earth. He doesn't see his ministry this way. He's not coming to earth to just patch up an old religious system. That's not why he's going to die. He's not going to die on the cross to just patch up a few things. Jesus is going to die on the cross for a whole radical, new, different approach that God's going to have with human beings, with a whole new covenant possible. Radically new. And with this, it's interesting to me that in his little parables that he tells, sometimes like these are two quick ones, apparently with the crowd there and the disciples of John, he doesn't give, at least Matthew doesn't tell us this, he doesn't give a lengthy explanation on these two little parables. He just tells them and lets them lay there and he goes. Oh. And so there's a part of Jesus' teaching that we may have to think about sometimes. And Jesus, as the master teacher, doesn't always put things out on a silver platter. I think I've told you this one time. We were working in a congregation where there was an individual who was very much opposed to my ministry in that congregation. And he called a special meeting. So I had to meet with him and the elders. It was a very unpleasant meeting. I don't like those kind of meetings. But he said, in the meeting, he goes, you know, you're our preacher, and we pay you to put everything on a silver platter for us. I said, say what? You pay me for what? I was dumbfounded. I didn't know how to answer that. I think my role was to help us learn, but to put things on a silver platter. What I am convinced is that God's design is that we all struggle with Jesus' teachings. We struggle with individually figuring out how that applies to our life, because all of our lives are different. We all have different struggles. We all have different lives. We all have different things that we have to decide as we want our faith to grow stronger. Jesus doesn't put things out on a silver platter all the time for his listeners. He'll just put it out there, and he'll tease. Have you noticed? It seems like in a lot of his teaching and his parables, he'll tease people with it. He'll only go so far, and then he stops. Well, see, that's the mark of a master teacher, that he wants you as the student to grapple with it. What does that mean? And we know that the disciples grappled with it, because when we get to chapter 13 on all of the parables, the disciples go come to Jesus and say, now you told us that parable. What does that mean? So when they come to that point that they're asking him, you know good and well, they've been scratching their heads and talking among themselves like, oh, we can't figure this out. He needs to explain this to us. So we're going to see that dynamic in chapter 13. Jesus raises a dead girl and heals a sick woman. We went through that. One thing is interesting about the, let me point, I think we mentioned this, but a synagogue leader came and knelt before Jesus. My daughter has just died. Jesus, and he says, put your hand on her and she will live. And Jesus went up with him and did so and so did his disciples. Then you've got the woman touching his coat. If I can only do that, it'll be healed. And Jesus says, take heart, daughter, your faith has healed you. And Jesus says, go away to the Father. The girl's not dead, but asleep. And Jesus, on occasions, sees evidence of the kind of faith that he's trying to build into his 12 disciples. And I can often, I often get the feeling that Jesus is frustrated with them, like, don't you guys get it? I mean, look over here. Look at the faith that this father has with his daughter died. Look at this lady that's worked her way through the crowd just to touch my coat. Don't you guys get it? So he's working with 12 guys who don't get it all the time. And another foundational pillar for Jesus' entire ministry, and the more I read through the Gospels, the more convinced I am of this. Of course, you know, he's divine, so he's got a bigger measure of this than we could ever have. But look at how patient Jesus is working with his disciples over the course of more than 3 years, and in many ways, they still don't get it. They still don't get it. But he's patient with them. He works with them. He's willing to work with them so that they can get to the point when he leaves the scene and ascends into heaven. Of course, they've been with him, and then they can take on his mission after he leaves. Jesus heals the blind and the mute. We talked about that last week. Let's begin with 9:35 through 38. Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness. Several times in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is depicted as proclaiming the good news of the kingdom. And I've often wondered what that sounded like, because at this point, see, he has not been nailed to the cross or resurrected. If I were to ask you, what is the good news of the kingdom? You probably would come up with something, well, it starts with the resurrection of Jesus our Lord. That's the greatest news ever. Well, at this point, though, Jesus hasn't been crucified, and he's not been raised from the dead, so you think, okay, if he's going around all these towns proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, what is that? Let me throw out the question. Do you have an idea what you think that might be? How can he be proclaiming the good news of the kingdom when he's not even resurrected yet? Anybody want to venture a guess? Say that? Oh, okay. I would think it would have to be at least starting with something about who God is, and think about, if we took that element, which I think is neat, to think about the historical sweep of God's relationship with his people and how God's love has always guided his interaction with his covenant people. Yeah, I'd say that'd be a great place to start. Anybody else want to take a guess? Because I don't know if you've thought about it. See, he's proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, but he hasn't been crucified and raised from the dead yet. So what is he proclaiming? We might have an answer. Turn over to Luke chapter 4. We might have a specific answer. Luke 4:14, Jesus returned to Galilee in the power of the Spirit. News about him spread through the whole countryside. Same thing we read in Matthew. He was teaching in their synagogues, and everyone praised him. And he went to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and on the Sabbath day he went into the synagogue, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. And unrolling it, he found the place where it was written. And so what he does now, he quotes from Isaiah 61. And this is verses 1 and 2. The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners, recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And so there at the synagogue, then he rolls the scroll back up, gives it to the attendant, and sits down. And at this point, they're all just, oh man, who is this guy? He spoke with such gracious words. They go, well, now, wait a minute. Isn't this Joseph's son? So some of them figured out who he is. Jesus said, well, surely you will quote this proverb to me, physician, heal yourself, and you'll tell me, do here in your hometown what we've heard about that you did in Capernaum. And truly I tell you, no prophet is accepted in his hometown. I assure you that there were many widows in Israel in Elijah's time. And then what's funny is he's going to give these quotes. He taps into these stories in the Old Testament, and they get it, because what he is saying is, outside of Israel that thought they had everything together, God reaches outside the boundaries of Israel and does a great work with some Gentile people. And they're like, oh, how could he say that? It's funny. The crowd that thinks he spoke with such gracious words, just a few verses later, look at verse 28. All the people in the synagogue were furious when they heard this. So they go from amazement at his gracious words to being furious with him. And they get up, they drive him out of town, they took him to the brow of the hill which the town was built in order to throw him off the cliff. But he walked right through the crowd and went on his way. But the reason I came to this synagogue scene is because he quotes from Isaiah 61, 1 and 2. And I get the impression that Jesus saw those two verses out of Isaiah as foundational for the framework of his whole ministry. And we've already seen in Matthew, and we will continue to see it, the theme of fulfillment. This was done that it might be fulfilled that was spoken by the prophet. And that occurs over and over in the book of Matthew. Well, what Jesus demonstrates in Luke 4 is the same thing. And he actually quotes from Isaiah 61, 1 and 2. And as Don said, I think those verses demonstrate different dimensions of God's great love for his covenant people. And also, as we found out in Luke 4, God's great love for people who are not even Israel. And the Jews didn't like that. Jesus went through all the towns then, this is Matthew 9, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness. So again, as we mentioned earlier, that's a pretty active ministry, isn't it? Think of all the sick people. Think of all the diseases that were brought to him. And when he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them. This is another foundational insight to the entire ministry of Jesus. Jesus' ministry was based on compassion. And we constantly can learn from that, can't we? If I am a disciple of Jesus and I have the viewpoint of compassion, how is that going to inform how I relate to others? Because sometimes that really gets challenged because there are people who rub me the wrong way and I'd rather not have compassion on them. Think about how we really struggle with that. And yet for Jesus, his whole ministry was based on compassion. I would say that it's that fundamental compassion that led him to the cross.